Hey there, it's Hurley from Inklips, and welcome to another embossing technique video. Now today I'm going to be sharing how to layer your embossing powders to create some different levels in your backgrounds, and also how to use layering stamps to layer the embossing powders as well to create some really cool effects because the powders are opaque. And once again, Tonic has provided me with that 10% off discount, so be sure to click the link in the description to go shopping and use the code SIMON at checkout to get 10% off of your order there. So that's awesome. You can stock up on your embossing powders or anything else that you've wanted from Tonic. This is one of my favorite embossing techniques and I'm excited to share it, so let's turn down to my work surface and get started. Alright, so starting off with this first card here, I'm going to share how to use layering stamps with the embossing powder to get a really cool dimensional effect. So I'm using this Build a Flower Peony Blossom set from Altenew, and I love this because it's got those really big images with the layering, so it gives a really graphic effect in the end. So I'm doing this onto a black card base here, and you want to make sure you apply lots of powder. And I'll kind of stress that throughout the video, but you really want to continue applying that powder to anti-static and make sure no powder sticks where you don't want to. So I'm adding that clear mark ink onto my large flower stamp here, and I'm stamping down the most solid image and giving it lots of pressure with fun foam underneath to make sure that all the ink transfers really nicely. So then I'll pour over some Nuvo kind of pink embossing powder there, and I'll tap off the excess and then start heating that. So with all these flowers, I heated them up from the back. I find that by heating it from the back, you get a lot smoother of a result, and these flowers are pretty big, so I wanted to make sure that everything was covered. And then with every color, I just dumped it back into the jar, and you don't have to waste any of the powder. So in between that layer, I'm applying that anti-static powder bag again, just to make sure that nothing will stick to that embossed image and that there's no fingerprints there. So I've moved along into the stamp platform here, and the reason why I'm doing this is because sometimes stamping on top of the embossing can be a little bit slippery, so doing this just gives that up and down pressure and makes sure it keeps all that detail. But I'll show you how to use an acrylic block in just a minute if you don't have a stamping tool. Once that's all stamped down, I pulled in that coffee filter again, and I'm going to bring in this darker red color from Nuvo and sprinkle that over the top, and you can see that it just sticks to those areas that we stamped down. And I really like this flower, probably the best out of all of them that I did today, just because it really has a lot of contrast with those two colors. So having the most contrast can give you a really bold and graphic look. So now I'm stamping down this second image here, and again I'm making sure to give lots of good pressure because I don't want to miss the area that's already embossed as I'm stamping. So then I'm applying that lilac kind of color there, and I'll heat set that once again from underneath the cardstock there. So it takes a little bit longer to do that, but it really does help to make sure it's nice and solid. So I'm applying that anti-static powder tool again between that layer, and I've moved back over into the stamp positioning tool, and I'm going to stamp it right down over top. So this is that second layer of the stamp with a little bit more detail in it. And then I'm going to pull that out, apply that purple color right over top, and then I'll heat that from the back again. And every time I'm done, I just move over to the front just to make sure everything's nice and melted. And then I'll do that same thing and repeat that step with the smallest flower, and I'll do it in that bottom left-hand corner. So you can see I'm overlapping some of the different flowers here, and you can play around with the layers, and I'll show that over in the next card once we're done with this one. But whatever color you stamp on top is the color that's going to be most dominant since everything is opaque here. So I've done it in that blue color there. I've heat embossed it from the back so it's nice and solid, and then I'm going to go in and do the top layer here as well. So again, applying that anti-static tool, taking that smaller layer and putting it right over top. And I'm using a little bit of fun foam inside of my stamping tool here, and I just flipped it over to the rubber side, and that allows to make sure that I get a perfect stamped impression because that fun foam is right underneath it. So I'll apply that darker blue color just to get a little bit of shadow here, and then heat set that again. So this is just like regular stamp layering where you do the lightest color in the biggest image and then bring in the darker color for the shadows and kind of the depth of the image there. And I've always fallen in love with stamp layering. This just kind of brings it to a whole new level with that texture and the opacity of the embossing powder because you can do it on darker backgrounds. So you get that really stunning contrast. Like today I'm doing it on this black cardstock and I really love that effect. So to finish off this scene, I'm adding some leaves in here from that same set. So I'm just stamping them down to fill in some of the areas and really finish off this flower kind of bouquet here. So then I'll do it with some of the other leaves that are going in the other direction as well, doing it in the most solid image with the lightest color of embossing powder that I'm using. So I'll stamp them down, and you can see I dropped my black there. I'll just make sure not to pour my powder over that area because it'll be sticky where I dropped that black. So I'm stamped that down, applied my powder here, and then I'm going to heat set that as well and kind of finish off this scene with that. So after I've heat set these leaves, I can then go in with the second layer here. And when I'm doing the second layer, I'm just using an acrylic block here, but again, I'm just really making sure that I press down with not too much pressure so it doesn't slip, and then just lift right up afterwards. And by doing that, you make sure you keep a really crisp image and have all that detail that the stamp was designed with. So for this top layer, I'm going in with some Ranger embossing powder here. I think it's Sage, just to finish off that top layer. So once I've completed my images here, I'm finishing off the scene with a quick white heat emboss sentiment. I wanted to keep it super simple since this embossing is very graphic and I didn't want any sequins or anything distracting from the background. So I stamped down "Wishing You a Lovely Birthday." I think this is from the Sakura Blossom stamp set. And then I'll heat emboss that to finish off this card, and I love that bright white sentiment. So then I'm going in with a Swiffer dusting cloth. I cut this down into a couple different pieces so I can use it more than once, but I'm just rubbing that over the surface of this cardstock because I applied that powder tool so much, it kind of tinted that cardstock. So by rubbing this over top, it picks up all the powder tool that was left over. So then I'm taking this into my little mini tonic trimmer, and I'm just cutting off the portion there. I decided not to leave it as just one flat card there because it was really warped in the end. So what I'm going to do is take this scrapbook.com 6-inch roll of tape. This stuff is a lifesaver, and I'm applying that to the back of it, and then I'll cut right around it using my Tim Holtz shears, which are really nice non-stick scissors, so nothing will stick to them and the adhesive won't gunk it up. Basically, I'm just cutting around the edges then, and by applying that whole sheet of adhesive on the back there, it'll really make sure that my image won't be warped on the card, and it'll all stay nice and flat and won't peel up randomly. So I peeled off the top section of it, and then I'll start applying it right onto the background here, starting at the top of the card base. It's a little bit tricky since this stuff is super sticky. So you want to make sure you're going in the right place, and then I'll slowly peel off the backing as I adhere down the background there. So this just really makes sure that I'm going to adhere it down nicely, and then it's all super flat once it's adhered down here. I pull off this adhesive, and it's super strong, so it'll stay nice and stuck there. So this stuff was a lifesaver on this card. So here's a close-up at that fun embossing, and I really love how that turned out with the different layers. Okay, so moving on to the next card, I'm going to really share how to mix the embossing powders and create different layers on the card because the embossing powders are opaque. So I'm using this layering stamp set from Gina as part of her StampnFoil line. This one has these fun butterflies in it. So I'm starting off with this larger butterfly and doing this on craft cardstock. So I had take my clear mark ink pad and stamp that butterfly down, and then I'm going to apply some embossing powder over top. So here I'm using this Nuvo black embossing powder, and it's got lots of fun sparkles in it. And then again, I'm going to heat it right from the back there until it's nice and shiny, and then I can move on to my next layer. So once I'm done with that, I'll take the detailed layer of that stamp. Well, actually, always apply the anti-static powder tool in between, and then I'll take the detailed version of that stamp and stamp it right over top. And then I'm going to mix a couple embossing powders here. So I'm using this red color from Nuvo and just really gently pouring it over the tips of the butterfly wings, and then I'll tap that off and put that right back into the jar. Then I'll move on to the pink embossing powder and then into a light baby blue kind of color. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure you pour each individual one back into the jars. But since you dumped it on, it gives kind of a rough edge there, so they really blend together nicely and give a really cool effect once they're embossed. So I'll heat that all up and make it permanent on my card by embossing it there, and then I'm going to move on to the next layer. So I put this inside my stamping tool just to make sure I get it right, and I'm going to stamp down this happy birthday sentiment from My Favorite Things. It's a really large stamp here. So I'm going to stamp it down in that clear mark ink again, and I'm stamping this over top of some of that butterfly. But it's going to actually show up over top of that butterfly, and it'll cover that up, which is kind of surprising, but it's something that's really fun with that embossing powder. So I'm using white embossing powder here, and that will block out that butterfly. So you can see as I heat up the sentiment here, you can see the sentiment is the one that stands out and the butterfly is behind it, even though we stamped the butterfly first. So whatever you want, make sure you layer it accordingly. So whatever image you stamp first is going to be the back image. Then I'm going to stamp this kind of fluttering away butterfly. And I'll stamp it a little bit, just overlapping that B and the H just a tiny little bit. And I'll do that in some brown embossing powder here. And I'll heat set that. So you can see that that took advantage and took power over top of a little bit of that happy birthday sentiment there. So I'm not covering it a ton, but I just want to cover it a little bit and make it look like those butterflies are kind of crowding around it and fluttering around the sentiment. So after I've heat set that over top, I've added that little layer of teal by stamping that down. And then I'm going to add one more butterfly to even it out and kind of give it that rule of 3. So here I'm stamping it just a little bit over one of those P's there, just to kind of overlap and give a fun effect. And then I'll do that in just solid black embossing powder there, heating it from the back to make sure it's nice and solid. Then I'll stamp down the top layer there with lots of detail, and I'm going to mix together some purple and some pink embossing powder there. And you'll notice that even if it goes over top of the purple a little bit, it all still runs off if it's just excess and has nothing to stick to. So I'll heat set that on the card there, and then I'm going to trim this down a lot smaller than it actually started. This one was a little bit warped too, so it actually ended up being a side folding card here. So I took lots of foam tape on the back of there to make sure it's not going to warp, and then I put it onto a top folding side oriented card. And to finish it off, I'm just going to add a little bit of Aqua Flow Shimmer Pen. So I squeezed this just a little bit to get lots of shimmer drops, and I'm just going to tap it in some little areas and create some butterflies right around, to create some bubbles right around these butterflies and finish off that background. So here's a closer look at that butterfly card. I love those fun layers and the mixed embossing powder. And then here's a closer look at both of those together. I really love this fun layering effect. So what do you guys think? I hope you really enjoyed that video and learned a little bit more about layering your embossing powders, and I cannot wait to see what you guys create with this fun technique. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a comment down below letting me know which one of these 2 cards were your favorite from today's video. I would love to chat with you all down there and hear more of your thoughts. So I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll see you all very soon for another card making and crafting video. Bye!